Welcome to the GovComms podcast, bringing you the latest insights and innovations from experts and thought leaders around the globe in government communication. Now, here is your host, David Pembroke.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to GovComms, the podcast that examines the practice of content communication in government and the public sector. My name's David Pembroke. Thanks for joining me. Today, my guest is Sora Park. Sora is the Associate Dean of Research and Professor of Communication in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra. Her research focuses on digital media, media markets and media policy, with a special focus on digital and social exclusion and the impact of technology on the distribution of opportunities and privileges in society. Sora was the former director of the News and Media Research Centre at the University of Canberra and chair of the Media Industry Studies Interest Group of the International Communication Association, and she is currently the president of the Australian and New Zealand Communication Association. She has extensive experience in policy research and consultancy in regards to digital media in South Korea. In the private sector, she's held consultancies with major internet and media companies such as KBS, NHN Corporation and MBC. Previously, she taught at Hanyang University, where she was the director of the Interdisciplinary Program of Women's Studies. From 2005 to 2006, she was the chair of the School of Communication Arts at Kwangwoon University in Seoul in Korea. And she has previously worked as a research fellow at the Korean Press Foundation and has been a visiting scholar at the University of California, San Diego and the Oxford Internet Institute, as well as the American University. And she joins me here in the studio. Sora, thanks very much for joining me on GovComms.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you.
So you're back, Sora. You're in Australia, but let's go back to South Korea. Where did that interest in media and the role of media first strike you as something that you wanted to dedicate your career to?
Yes, so when I was very young, I worked as a writer for a major broadcast in Korea called KBS, and I wrote for lots of entertainment programs. So it was a lot of fun. But at that time, which was in the 90s, there was a lot of changes going on in the media market. And I could see that the industry was changing so rapidly, and there were mentions of digitalizing and, internet had just arrived. And so I really wanted to have more opportunities and see where the industry is going. So I decided I should study more. So I chose to study in the US and do a communication and media studies degree. And I ended up studying media economics and media industry studies, which gave me a really good, solid background of how to understand all the changes that were happening at that time. And then, that's how I became an academic.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was that experience like, going to the United States to study?
Oh, very, very shocking and different from Korea in many, many ways, but especially regarding the media markets. Korea is a very protected, heavily regulated, concentrated media environment, and the government has very tight control. At that time, government has very tight control of the media companies, whereas in America, it was much more subtle, and it was basically a free market. And so that was a very different environment to what I'd been used to. So it was very interesting to see the two different countries and different approaches. Yeah.
And what were the big insights that you took away from that period of study?
I realized that although the US media companies dominate globally, like Hollywood and all these digital platforms now, and they have definitely strength in operating in a very market-oriented environment, rather than like a government-restricted, regulated environment, and that's where their strength is. But I realized that's the anomaly. In most countries, media markets aren't as free as in the US. So definitely there's strengths and weaknesses, but the weakness in the American style is that because it's driven by market power and profits, in most cases, in a lot of the cases, the public's voice or things like equity and fairness and balance could be compromised. But again, it's an anomaly. Like most countries operate the opposite.
Yeah, indeed. And certainly over there, I think the First Amendment right that Americans have also has quite a big impact on the way that they cover different topics in the United States. Do you think how does that change it for the citizen in the American market, that there is such freedom and it is driven by such, the protection of free speech? Mm-hmm. How does that change the way that the media market works in the United States?
So I think there is a lot of trial and error and a lot of, loss and waste in getting to that optimal point. But I think that's also their strength, that they wait until things have been discussed and things have been, coordinated within the market. So I think that's the strength that they have. They fight for something like within the market, and the optimal player survives. Not that it's always good for the whole public or the whole country, but just within the market, I think the players who survive are those who are innovative and respond to their customers. So there's definitely strength there. Yeah.
So how then did you make your way to Australia to become an academic here in Australia?
Yeah, so I've moved around a lot since I was very young because my father was a journalist. So I like experiencing different cultures, different countries. And so after my studies in the US, I went back to Korea and became an academic there. But because I've lived in so many different cultures, adjusting back in Korea was not very easy because Korea has a very, traditional, how can I say, it's a very homogenous and very traditionally based culture. So people like me who have experienced many different cultures sometimes find it hard to adjust. But I really enjoyed staying there for about 10 years. And then it got to a point where I thought maybe I should be experiencing some new cultures now. And I wasn't going to, go somewhere that's completely foreign, but somewhere where I thought I could adjust, where I can, speak the language and know the culture. And I thought at that time, Australia would be very similar to the US or UK that I grew up in. So I thought it would be like a very risk-free place to explore. But it turned out to be very different. But I like it here, and I decided to stay. So I've been here about 10 years now. Mm. Yeah.
So what are the differences? When you arrived in Australia, what did you think?
First of all, it's not the typical Western culture where like Koreans like me or Asians like me think Western culture is very individualistic. Everyone looks after themselves. But in Australia, I realized that's not the case. Everyone is not individualistic, not in the sense of like in the US or Europe. It's much more, family-oriented, more group-oriented. You care about your colleagues. You mind others. So I think that's definitely a huge difference between here and America or, UK.
And in that, have you, in your time here, that you've been here 10 years, has that got stronger? Or has that weakened in
Australia?
Yeah, in your observation of time, and obviously through this COVID period? What would your observations be?
That's very interesting. I think it's gone stronger because I think, especially even before COVID, Australia is like geographically much closer to Asia than anywhere else. And I think the influence, and there's a lot of Asians living here, a lot of exchange. So I think there is that influence that Australia is more open to embracing Asian cultures because of the proximity, and Asian cultures are usually more family-oriented, more group-oriented, thinking about the society rather than the individual. So I think, in that direction, it's definitely growing.
It's a great part of Australia, though, isn't it? That the multicultural society, where it is a genuine multicultural society. We had the post-World War migration from Europe, and obviously the integration with the Asia Pacific. It throws up quite an interesting place to live and to experience.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it is a very interesting place to live, I think. Yeah.
So in terms of the media market and your observations of it, what are you seeing at the moment? There are so many issues in media at the moment, and they do go to the issue of government seeking to communicate effectively inside that market, and how can they participate effectively so they can explain policy, so they can explain decisions, so they can explain programs. And I think through COVID in particular, you have seen that there is a real appetite from the public to get the information from the political leaders, because they want to know, particularly when there is a crisis as there is at the moment. But if I might sort of take you up, to a higher level, looking down on the media market, what would your commentary be at the moment about the current state of the media market here in Australia, and then more broadly around the world?
Yep. So in Australia and in other countries, media markets are all experiencing so rapid changes, and they're losing advertising to digital platforms. They're losing audiences to digital platforms. So it's a very challenging time, and I think COVID has, accelerated that challenge. The role of government, I think, is because the media markets have changed so much. So in the past, Australia was very, very concentrated, like only 2-3 players, dominating the whole audiences and what they read and view. But now it has changed so rapidly. It would be very hard for governments to actually shift the paradigm so they can embrace the changes but also support the media markets. I think that would be a huge challenge. But one promising aspect of all these changes is that audiences or users or citizens can directly access information that's coming from the government. And there is a definite trend, because I'm part of this global study called the Digital News Report, and we ask people, we didn't ask it this year, but we, on certain years, we ask, do you actually follow, government messaging or politicians or journalists by following them on social media? And we can see an upward trend. And we also did a recent
And was
study.
that before COVID?
Yes.
Were you starting to see that
yes,
people were
yes.
starting to be a little bit more engaged?
Much more engaged
Okay.
directly with the sources. And we were able to confirm that during COVID. We did another study during COVID on media consumption patterns of Australians, and we found that people would directly go to the source more than through news media or social media. So they would go to government websites, health organizations, health experts, to find information about COVID. So whether or not this was because it's a critical health information is really unknown yet. We have to investigate other areas. But at least within the COVID context, we do know people reach out to government directly for information, and they find that very reassuring, because the trust level is also much higher. So those who access government websites, health organizations, they have a much higher trust in the information they find on those sites compared to information filtered by journalists or social media, which is dramatically different from what we encountered like 10, 20 years ago, where people mostly relied on news media to, vouch for information. But now they're trusting them less, and they're going directly to the source.
So in terms of that, the audience, the citizen coming to those government sites, the experience is often not quite what it needs to be, particularly when you compare it to a media site or a social site. It doesn't work as quickly. It's probably not as visual. There's not as much video. It's not as updated as often as it needs to be. What advice do you have to the publishers who are now living inside government organisations and growing their capability? What's the best way that they can meet the needs of these information-hungry citizens as they come direct to them for information?
Yeah, I think everyone, including individuals, have to become a journalist. Like, they have to be able to tell their stories and be able to tell it in a way that the audience can digest. So if the audience wants visual, they have to be able to, make a video clip. If the audience wants audio, they have to tell the story. So I think, and especially like big organizations like government and big companies, they should invest in telling their stories and at the level of their customers and who comes to their sites. So yeah, I guess it's a whole new world in governments investing in direct communication to the public in such a way. But that's definitely the trend that we're seeing.
And the thing is that it's not only the trend, but it's coming fast. And the demands are coming fast. The demands from ministers to be active, to be explaining what it is they're doing, to be able to be producing the video, the audio, the animation, the graphics. It really does sort of point to a different type of capability that needs to service this emerging need. So as an educator in this space, how can people improve? How can people acquire these really important content creation and distribution skills such that they are, helping to deliver for government, which is why, people work in the public sector?
Yep. The short answer to that is come study with us.
There's the softball straight over the fence.
But I think the whole educational system
needs
to shift media literacy, or we could call it something else, but media literacy is probably the most common word we use, should be taught in schools, which they are, but it should be broadened and it should be part of everyone's, growing up. They learn how to tell stories through many different platforms. That's just the way the world is structured now. So basic media literacy in schools, but also embedded in all the tertiary education as well. So even if you're studying medical science, you should have the basic communication skills. So that's probably the direction that we're heading towards. But changing education systems is quite very hard, but I think that's the direction we're all going to.
Yeah, so it becomes much more of a core around your
yeah.
education as opposed to a specialisation, although there will remain specialisation. But I'm interested. Education systems are going to have to change. They are changing. And we had a great conversation here last week or the week before with Professor Mick Cardew-Hall from the ANU about how that big institution is trying to evolve and adapt to meet the needs of a more digital world. Surely education systems are going to have to evolve more rapidly than they have in the past, and they're going to have to move to meet the needs, or otherwise people will go around them to get what it is that they actually need. Yep,
yeah. So at the university level, the change is coming and quite rapidly so. So we are offering many different ways to not just educate the young people who come to university, but the older generations, the people who are in the workforce. We do try to provide educational programs that are tailored to their needs. So it wouldn't be enrolling in 3-year degrees, but it would be much shorter, intensive type of educational programs. And I think that kind of courses would be growing in the next decade or so. Yeah.
So in terms of this evolving sort of changing landscape, you mentioned a few things there, and I think a couple of things I do want to talk to you about is the the omnipotence of the platforms, your Googles and Facebooks and, Instagrams. They are so powerful. They are so big. And they have destroyed the traditional media model by and large. There are a few sort of standouts like, the New York Times is a good example. Washington Post, although it helps if you've got a multi-billionaire sort of cashing, writing the checks for you. So what about the platforms? What role do they have to play, particularly as it relates to misinformation and disinformation? Because it's a big problem and something's got to be done.
Yes, it is a huge problem now, and something has to be done now. And I think many countries are experimenting with various arrangements, and I think Australia is one of the leaders in that we have the News Media Bargaining Code that is being negotiated at the moment. We have the voluntary code that will try to, reduce misinformation or disinformation that are on the platforms. So the overall direction is, I think, for the government to be more involved in how we regulate the platforms and how we ensure that, all the voices are heard. But it is a big challenge because most of the digital platforms, the big players, are not Australian companies, and it's very hard for one country to regulate a multinational corporation. So I guess it's like we need an internationally concerted effort in doing that. And I think Europe's doing a bit of that ahead of the countries, and Australia's doing more. But going back to the role of digital platforms, it has given opportunities to many, many small players, like people who would never have been able to reach their audiences are now reaching audiences through these digital platforms. So it's a double-edged sword. So it's given a lot of opportunities, but then in doing so, they've become much, much more bigger and more powerful. We need to find the balance between where we support the smaller voices and where the big platforms can provide opportunities to media news companies or everyone who wants to reach audiences.
So, just as an aside, given that you've spent some time in the United States, what's your view on the antitrust hearings of the major platforms where, I think it's even today that there may, the Department of Justice might have, I think, there's an action against Google, and then obviously there's the wider hearing around antitrust. Do you think that they will be broken up, that Google could lose YouTube, Facebook could become Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook? Do you think that that's a threat? I wish I know the answer, but if you look back in history, it is in the US system, it is very hard to break up large companies through that antitrust system. Look at Hollywood studios; they were never able to break that up. Look at all the, Bell Atlantic, the AT&T, they did get them in the end.
break it up, but they couldn't break up the whole monopoly in those markets. So perhaps they might be able to break up the platforms into smaller companies, but would they be able to reduce the concentration in the market? I think that's another question. So I am... At the moment, I'm quite sceptical, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So more broadly then, about media, and what's your view on the traditional players? Where do they find their home now in this distributed model where everybody is in the publishing business now?
Yeah.
Where do the traditional players find their place, and how do they survive? How do they get through where they are at the moment, and how do they get to a point where they can flourish into the future?
Yeah. So I think, as a media scholar, it is still very important to have public interest journalism, that people are informed with, verified facts, analysis, and, all the knowledge that the media companies have accumulated over time that is different from just any information being circulated. So I do see there's like quality news that is so important in the society for citizens to make informed decisions, that there needs to be some way to, guarantee that everyone has access to quality information. And at the moment, if we leave it to the market, that's not going to happen, because look at all the closures in regional areas, small news media closing down, because advertisers are going to digital platforms, and advertisers don't differentiate between news and non-news content. So it's going to get worse and worse. So unless the government steps in, or some kind of, there must be a broader measure to ensure that quality news can be accessed by anyone and everyone. So I think urgent.
Do you think the ACCC measures are going to be enough here in Australia to sustain regional media, for example, or are they not going to get the money? Is the money going to stay with the big players in the capital cities?
I think the direction of the ACCC's recommendations is very promising, and I agree with all the directions. But there might need to be slightly more in terms of support of regional.
But there's also but there has been the regional media fund as well that the government has set up as well, isn't there? So there is money, a little bit more money for them.
Yes, so I think that will maintain some of the regional media, but how long and how sustainable they are, I think we might need a longer-term investment in that.
But if we circle back, though, to some of your research that said that there is an increasing appetite for, verified facts, for information, for surely that maybe could it evolve to a business model that sustains it, that, driven by the community, driven by a demand for knowledge and the truth, in inverted commas, that there may in fact be a business model that could be developed off that?
Yeah, I think so. So in our global study, the Digital News Report, we do see a very slow but upward growth in the number of people who subscribe to online news. Yeah, so they pay a monthly fee, or and it's very, very slow.
Well, I suppose I'm a sort of super user, because I subscribe. I spend hundreds of dollars every month. I subscribe to everything, but I think I'm not a very good example.
You'd be an outlier. So most people who do subscribe to one.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's
one?
And 2 or more.
Don't tell my wife. She never listens anyway.
But there is a growth and there is a trend, so it will get there. But how soon and how much is of question. And in the meantime, if all the news businesses go out of business, there'll be nobody to subscribe to. So I think in the interim, we do need some, support so that because media consumption is a result of a habit. You have to acquire a habit for a long period of time. You're not going to change your habit in a day. So until people are willing to pay for news and change their habits of accessing news, it'll be a long journey. So in the meantime, we do need some kind of governmental support.
Is it fair to say that there are still large numbers of students enrolling in journalism courses because they want to do journalism now, which may seem unusual that as the sort of industry collapses ahead of them, that they're still taking the risk and they still want to get that education in journalism? Yes.
So we definitely, young people are still interested in studying journalism, and they do study. But because the field is changing rapidly, they don't always seek jobs as a traditional journalists working for a news company. They can get jobs anywhere. Like I mentioned before, governments and organizations, they have to somehow shift to, communicating directly with the public, and they will need people who are equipped with those journalistic skills to tell their stories. So,
which I think is actually quite useful, even from an ethics point of view, that people going into those jobs actually are trained and educated in the ethics of journalism. So when they are creating content in private sector companies in government that they have that grounding in journalism ethics, such that they'll create good content, which is valuable and true and fair.
So we're seeing a lot of that happening among our graduates, that they go into any sector or any organisation, and and their skills are valued by those organisations.
Okay, I'm going to throw you into the time machine and take you forward 10 years, ask you to look back. What do you see? Where does it evolve? How does the media market evolve and grow, and how do you participate in that as a citizen or as a government effectively? What are the things that you're going to be seeing in 10 years down the track?
Yeah. I think in the media market will change definitely, but it will change in the direction of, unbundling. So in the past, news companies used to do everything, deliver all the stories. But we're already seeing a lot of that now. Like even with podcasts, you have very specialized, podcasts, you have specialized, channels. So I think that a lot of unbundling will happen, and there'll be specialists and, experts in particular topics.
And it'll get narrower and narrower and narrower, won't it?
Yeah. Of course, everyone will need like a general news presented to them. But whether or not that will be a company doing the job or some aggregator compiling information from various sources, we don't know yet. But the overall direction is that much more specialized, more focused, more in-depth information that is produced by, it could be smaller players, it could be big players, but definitely that, specialization would be very important, I think,
Okay, well, Professor Sora Park, thank you so much for coming into the studio today and giving up some of your very valuable time, and thank you for the work that you continue to do in the research of this critically important area for people who work in government communication, because people do have to understand what's changing in the market and how can they deliver good content and good stories so people can understand what governments are actually up to. You will know if you are a regular listener, and if you've not and you've just stumbled upon the podcast, the GovComms Festival is launching on November the 17th. It is a 24-hour festival that will be launching here in Canberra, Australia on 10 a.m. at the 17th of November. We will be going through the day and the night, going around the world. We will follow the sun, having conversations not too dissimilar to the one that we've just had with Sora Park, drawing on different people from around the world, their experience, their knowledge, their points of view, their debates, the conversations that are really going to start to help synthesise and start to sort of draw together a community that can start to examine the practice of communication inside government and really go to the point that Sora raised there before, is that we're all in the communication business now, whether we like it or not, and as government communicators we have to get better at being able to create useful, relevant, consistent content and to be able to communicate that consistently over time to specific audience so they can understand what indeed the detail is of that policy, program, service or regulation. So Google GovComms Festival, jump on, please register. First 1,500 people are free, and for those who are not in the first 1,500, it'll cost you $10, so it's not very expensive either. So, and we have some great news. The emerging local government leaders in North America are providing a wonderful program. We've got some big news in the coming weeks coming out of Europe as well. Asia is looking very strong, and certainly here at home in Australia, some great content that you won't want to miss. So really looking forward to the GovComms Festival. Please make sure you register. Thanks again to Sora Park for coming in, and thanks to you, the audience, for coming back once again. I'll be back at the same time with another great guest here on the GovComms, but for the moment, it's bye for now.
You've been listening to the GovComms podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes.